The distant stars twinkled ominously as Captain John Miller's ship cut through the cold void of space. He sat in the cockpit, eyes locked on the radar screen, his fingers moving over the controls with the precision of someone who had spent years in space combat. But this mission, unlike others, felt different. The assignment was simple: find the rebel slave girl, Isla, and ensure she didn't escape the clutches of the Empire. But as his ship neared the remote planet, something didn't sit right. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far greater was at play here. In the distance, the faint glow of a small settlement came into view. The once quiet, barren landscape now stirred with life. Isla, the girl he was supposed to capture, had become a legend among the rebels, feared by the Empire and hunted across the galaxy. They called her the Ghost of the Empire, a rogue fighter who had eluded every capture attempt. The stories about her were terrifying. A girl who had taken down entire platoons of the Empire's elite soldiers, using nothing but her wits, a cloaking device, and a relentless will to survive. John's orders were clear: bring her in dead or alive. But as the ship descended toward the planet's surface, his thoughts were clouded. He wasn't the kind of man to follow orders blindly, especially when the target wasn't just a fugitive. Isla was a symbol. She was someone who had defied the most powerful empire in the galaxy. He couldn't help but feel a strange admiration for her, even if she was considered a threat. This mission felt different. It felt personal. Suddenly, a series of sharp beeps interrupted his thoughts. The radar flickered as a cloaked ship, barely detectable by the sensors, appeared on his screen. The same ship Isla had used to escape from countless other battles. He knew it had to be her. She had made it this far. How was he supposed to stop her? John's mind raced. He could already feel the pressure mounting. He had to act fast. If he hesitated, she'd slip away like she always did. He activated his ship's weapon systems and made a sharp turn toward the cloaked vessel. He wasn't just going to track her down. He was going to catch her. As the planet's surface grew closer, the situation became even more dangerous. John's ship was under constant threat from a barrage of enemy fire, and the rebels had set up automated defenses all over the planet. A sudden explosion rocked his ship, and alarms blared. It was clear now. The fight had begun. John knew that if he didn't act now, he might lose his chance to capture Isla forever. On the ground, Isla was already one step ahead. She darted through the ruins of an old abandoned military base, moving with the agility of someone who had lived a lifetime on the run. Her heart raced as she heard the sounds of approaching ships overhead. She could feel the presence of the enemy closing in. Her cloak had already activated, but she knew it wouldn't last long. She was no stranger to being hunted, but there was something different about this time. She could feel the weight of her past bearing down on her. If she didn't escape now, she might never get another chance. Isla paused for a moment, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cloak generator around her neck. It was a powerful tool, one that had kept her alive in countless close calls. But it was also draining on her energy, and she knew it wouldn't hold up forever. Every moment was a gamble. She had no choice but to keep moving, to keep outsmarting her pursuers. John's ship hovered above the planet as he navigated the chaos below. He had one goal: catch her. He couldn't afford to lose her, not after everything. But as he scanned the area below, he saw nothing. His heart sank. Had she already slipped past him? Was she truly the ghost the Empire said she was? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something, a flicker of movement. There, barely visible, was Isla. For a brief moment, their eyes met. A shock of recognition passed between them. She wasn't just a fugitive to him anymore. She was someone who had fought for her freedom, someone who didn't deserve to be captured by the Empire. Without thinking, John hit the throttle, sending his ship into a steep dive toward the ground. The chase was on. As his ship hurtled toward the surface, John realized that this wasn't going to be a simple capture. There was something about Isla that was different from the other rebels he had encountered. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something bigger. And for the first time, John felt torn between following his orders and respecting her fight for freedom. The ship landed with a deafening crash, and the ground shook beneath them. As the dust settled, Isla took off running again, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. She was fast, but John was faster. He leaped from his ship and sprinted after her, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just a mission. It was a game of life and death. Isla's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself harder. She couldn't afford to be caught. She had to escape, to keep fighting for the cause. But something unexpected happened. As she glanced back over her shoulder, she saw John, a soldier from a world she had always despised, closing in on her. Instead of reaching for his weapon, he reached out his hand, as though offering her a choice. Isla hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Could she trust a human, of all people, to help her? With one final glance at the approaching soldiers, she made her decision. She ran toward him. And in that instant, everything changed. The chase had become something else entirely. Isla's heart raced as she sprinted through the thick forest, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The ground beneath her was rough, uneven. Everything was a blur. She had no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't stop, not with John so close behind. His presence was unsettling, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't here to kill her. That thought made her hesitate for the briefest moment, just long enough for him to catch up. John lunged forward, grabbing her arm before she could turn another corner. His grip was firm but not harsh, just enough to stop her. Isla's pulse pounded in her temples as she tried to twist out of his grasp. For a split second, her mind screamed at her to fight him off. She had fought countless soldiers before, but there was something different about this one. He wasn't like the others. The determination in his eyes wasn't the cold, impersonal kind she had seen from the Empire's soldiers. This was something else. "What do you want from me?" Isla demanded, her voice sharp. She tugged against his hold, but he didn't let go. He only tightened his grip, not in aggression, but in a way that suggested he wasn't going to hurt her. At least not yet. "I don't want to hurt you," John said, his voice steady, almost reassuring. "I've been ordered to bring you in, but I'm not here to kill you. I just need to know why you're fighting this war." His words confused her, making her pause for a moment. The Empire didn't care about reasons. They only cared about obedience. They only cared about control. No one, especially a soldier, ever questioned their orders. "You're lying," Isla spat, her face flushed with anger. She could feel her pulse thumping in her ears, and her instincts screamed at her to break free. She had fought so hard to stay free, to stay alive. There was no way she was going to trust this man. John lowered his gaze, his grip loosening slightly. "I'm not lying," he said quietly. "I saw the Empire destroy everything I believed in. They don't care about people like you. But I do. I've been fighting my own battles against them. And I think, deep down, you know that." Isla stared at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. But there was none. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of something in his eyes, something human. She didn't know whether it was trust or desperation, but it unsettled her. She wasn't used to this. People like John didn't exist in her world. "You think I'll just trust you because you say so?" Isla asked, a laugh escaping her lips. It was bitter, filled with years of mistrust. "You're an Empire soldier. You're all the same. You'll betray me like the rest." John's eyes hardened, but there was still an underlying sadness there. "I'm not asking for your trust," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm not going to turn you over. You're not going to die because of me." Isla froze. His words hit her harder than she cared to admit. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever shown her this kind of mercy. She was used to being hunted, to being seen as a threat, not as someone worth saving. But still, she couldn't afford to lower her guard. The battle wasn't over, And there was always a cost to trusting someone. She had learned that the hard way. She pushed the thought aside and focused on what mattered: survival. "We need to get out of here," she said, pulling away from him and taking a few steps back. "The Empire's coming for us. We don't have much time." John nodded, glancing around at the surrounding trees. The sound of engines was growing louder by the second. He could feel the tension building, the urgency. They didn't have time to argue. They had to move fast. Without another word, they both took off running, weaving through the dense underbrush, their breaths coming in short, quick bursts. John wasn't used to running through alien terrain, but he could feel the adrenaline rushing through his veins. Every step was a race against time. Behind them, the Empire's soldiers were closing in, and they had to get far enough ahead to avoid detection. Isla was faster, her body honed by years of running and fighting. She led the way, her sharp eyes scanning the ground for any signs of danger. But she wasn't just running away. She was running towards something. The feeling of being hunted was something she had learned to live with, but it was different now. For the first time, she wasn't running alone. She had John by her side. As they ran, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. He was no longer just a soldier chasing a fugitive. He was part of her fight now, and he didn't know if he was ready for what that meant. But one thing was clear: Isla wasn't just another mission. She wasn't just another target. She was someone who had been fighting for her freedom for far too long. And somehow, despite everything, despite the years of distrust and pain, John found himself fighting for her too. They reached the edge of the forest, where the ground became rockier and the terrain more difficult. The sound of approaching footsteps reminded them that the Empire was closing in. But Isla wasn't afraid. She had been here before, and she had always found a way out. But this time, things were different. She had John at her side, and that, for better or worse, made all the difference. Without a word, she activated her cloaking device. John followed suit, pulling the hood of his cloak over his head. The world around them went dark as they faded from view, the only sound their hurried breathing. As they moved deeper into the shadows, Isla couldn't help but glance at John. For the first time, she wasn't running alone. And though she didn't fully trust him yet, she knew one thing for sure: they were in this together now. And together, they might just stand a chance. The wind whipped through the trees as John and Isla moved silently through the dense jungle. The cloaking devices hummed softly, blending them into the environment, making them nearly invisible to anyone passing by. Their only hope was to reach the underground tunnels hidden deep within the mountains, where they could disappear for a while, regroup, and plan their next move. But as the shadows stretched long across the terrain, Isla's mind was already racing. The Empire wasn't far behind. John kept his pace steady beside her, his movements almost too calm, given the circumstances. Isla could feel the tension rising in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder every few steps, her eyes darting through the darkness, searching for any signs of the soldiers who had been hunting her for days. But so far, the jungle had been silent. The Empire hadn't found them yet. They reached a narrow ridge that overlooked a wide valley, and Isla signaled for them to stop. She needed a moment to catch her breath, to think. The cliff's edge was a good vantage point. They could spot anyone coming from miles away, but there was a heavy weight in the air. The Empire wasn't just a threat. They were a machine, an unstoppable force, and Isla knew they wouldn't stop until she was captured or dead. "What's the plan now?" John asked, his voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't harsh or impatient, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it, as if he was trying to figure out where he stood in all of this. Isla took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had always been a step ahead, always calculated every move. But now, with John at her side, things felt different. She had to trust him, even if only for the moment. "We keep moving," she said firmly. "There's a hidden base a few miles west. We can't stop now. If we do, they'll find us." John didn't hesitate. He simply nodded and followed as she took off again, her pace quickening. The night stretched before them, a vast, unknown expanse that seemed endless. But the more they moved, the more Isla's instincts screamed that they were being watched. By the time they reached the foot of the mountain range, Isla's fears were confirmed. The Empire had found their trail. Blasts of blinding light suddenly filled the air as the unmistakable sound of heavy artillery echoed from the distance. John's hand shot out, pulling Isla down behind a cluster of boulders, just as a massive explosion erupted to their left. The force of it rocked the ground, sending tremors through their bones. Dirt and rocks rained down on them, and Isla's heart skipped a beat. They had to keep moving. "We need cover," Isla shouted over the roar of the explosions, her voice a mix of fear and urgency. She could feel the heat of the blasts searing the air around them. The Empire had arrived in full force. John barely flinched, his military training kicking in as he grabbed her arm and yanked her toward a series of caves hidden beneath the jagged rocks. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to squeeze through, but it offered them the cover they desperately needed. Inside, the air was thick and cool, the darkness wrapping around them like a cloak. John activated a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the blackness, and they made their way deeper into the cave. The sound of distant explosions reverberated off the walls, sending a chill down Isla's spine. The Empire wasn't far behind, and they would search every inch of the area until they found them. "How long can we stay here?" John asked quietly as he scanned the cave's entrance. "Not long," Isla muttered, her mind racing. "They'll send search teams, sweep the area. We're already too close to their base." John's eyes narrowed, and he crouched down next to Isla, checking his weapons. "We'll have to fight our way out." His words were calm, steady, but there was a fire in his gaze, a determination that reminded Isla of something she had almost forgotten. What it felt like to have someone fighting beside her, not just for her, but with her. She didn't respond right away. The reality of what they were about to face hit her hard. The Empire wasn't just an army. They were a force of nature, and they didn't make mistakes. They didn't lose. But something in John's words stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. We fight," she said finally, her voice low but filled with resolve. "We make our stand here." Just as the words left her mouth, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the cave, faint but unmistakable. The search had begun. They didn't have much time. John quickly worked on setting up a trap, using rocks and debris to block the entrance, making it appear like the cave was abandoned. Isla kept watch, her senses on high alert as she listened to the approaching soldiers. Every nerve in her body screamed to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Not anymore. The Empire would stop at nothing to capture her, to silence her. But they had underestimated one thing. Isla wasn't afraid of dying. She had been through hell and come back, and she had no intention of going back without a fight. And with John at her side, she might just have a chance to turn the tide. As the soldiers drew closer, Isla and John braced themselves for what was to come. The Empire had struck back, but they didn't realize that this time, it wasn't just Isla they had to worry about. It was both of them. Two warriors fighting against a machine that never stopped. They were about to make the Empire realize they were no longer in control. The underground base was nothing like Isla had imagined. It was a hidden labyrinth carved into the heart of the mountains, a place that had been shielded from the Empire's watchful eyes for years. The walls, made of reinforced metal and stone, hummed with a quiet energy, and the air smelled faintly of machine oil and dust. It was a world apart from the chaos above ground, a place where the scattered remnants of resistance fighters gathered, away from the Empire's reach. Yet, even in this remote location, the weight of danger hung heavy in the air. Isla had led them through a series of narrow corridors, and now they stood in front of a heavy steel door, its surface covered in complex markings. This was it, the heart of the resistance. She could feel the pulse of something greater here, something that had been growing in the shadows for years. It wasn't just a safe house. It was the last hope for freedom. John stood beside her, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he expected an attack at any moment. Isla had explained the importance of this place, but he still didn't know everything. She could see the questions in his eyes. But for now, they had to wait. The moment they walked through that door, everything would change. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a large, dimly lit room. It was filled with people, men and women of all races and species, their faces worn from years of hiding and fighting. They were the last remnants of a broken galaxy, people who had refused to bow down to the Empire's rule. At the center of the room, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-gray hair looked up from a table covered in maps and tactical data. His gaze immediately locked onto Isla. "Isla," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of years of struggle. "You've brought someone with you." Isla stepped forward, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of respect and something deeper, an old connection. "This is John," she said, introducing him with a nod. "He's a soldier. We're going to need his help." John didn't speak right away. He just stood still, taking in the room, the faces around him. Isla could see the skepticism in his posture, the uncertainty of a man who had spent most of his life fighting for a cause he didn't fully understand. But as his eyes met the resistance leaders, there was a spark of recognition, of understanding that this fight was bigger than any one person. The man, General Corrin, stood up, walking toward them. His eyes were sharp, but there was a quiet sadness behind them, the kind that came from years of watching comrades fall and seeing the Empire's power grow stronger with each passing day. "We've been watching the Empire's movements," he said, his voice low but firm. "And we've been waiting for someone like you, Isla." Isla felt the weight of his words, the pressure of the responsibility that came with being the symbol of the resistance. She had always been a fighter, but now she was something more. The fate of countless worlds rested on her shoulders. "We need more than just soldiers," General Corrin continued. "We need leaders. We need people who can unite the scattered forces across the galaxy and lead them into battle. If we're going to stop the Empire, it won't be through guerrilla tactics alone. We need a strike that will shake the Empire to its core." Isla nodded, feeling the fire of determination reignite in her chest. This was it. This was the fight she had been born for. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. The Empire wasn't just an enemy. It was a machine, a force of nature that consumed everything in its path. And yet, despite the odds, Isla believed in something stronger. The heart of the resistance, the unity of those who refused to give up. John's voice broke through her thoughts. "What can I do to help?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent. The man who had once been an outsider was now fully committed to their cause. There was no turning back. General Corrin turned to John, his gaze assessing. "You're not just a soldier," he said, his voice sharp. "You're someone who can lead. We need more than just fighters. We need people who can inspire others. If we're going to take on the Empire, we need every soldier, every leader, every ally we can find. You have the skills to rally the people." John stood a little taller, his confidence growing. He had always been a soldier, but now he could see that his role was more important than just following orders. He had a part to play in something far bigger than himself. Corrin walked over to a large display screen that illuminated a holographic map of the galaxy. He tapped a few buttons, and the map zoomed in on a distant planet, a strategic hub for the Empire. "This is the heart of the Empire's operations. If we can disrupt their supply lines here, it will cripple their war machine. But it's not going to be easy. We're going to need all the firepower we can muster." Isla stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the mission ahead. Corrin's gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They both knew the stakes. This wasn't just a raid. It was the beginning of the end. "We strike fast," he said. "We hit them where it hurts. The Empire thinks they've won, but they haven't seen the heart of the resistance. They don't know what we're capable of." The room was silent for a moment, each person processing the gravity of what was being proposed. Then, one by one, the resistance fighters nodded in agreement. They were ready to fight. They were ready to die for this cause. Isla turned to John, her gaze steady. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with the weight of what they were about to face. John didn't hesitate. "I'm with you," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Let's bring the Empire down." And so the heart of the resistance began to beat louder, stronger. Together, they would face the Empire's wrath. And together, they would fight for the future of the galaxy. The war had just begun, and they would stop at nothing to see it through. The mission was supposed to be simple, or at least that's what Isla had believed. The Empire's hold on the galaxy was absolute, but the resistance had a plan that would disrupt their operations, cripple their resources, and send a message. They had gathered their forces, made their preparations, and now they were ready, or so they thought. The night before the attack, Isla couldn't sleep. The weight of the upcoming assault sat heavy on her chest. She walked through the base, her footsteps echoing in the quiet corridors. She passed soldiers quietly preparing their gear, strategists hunched over their data screens, and medics organizing supplies. The air was thick with anticipation and the fear of what was to come. John had been by her side the entire time, helping with the strategy, lending his strength to the troops, and offering words of encouragement. He was a natural leader, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of trust in him, even though their bond had only been forged recently. But she knew, deep down, that this mission would change everything. The risks were too high. Isla stopped at a window that overlooked the vast mountains. The stars sparkled brightly above, but she didn't feel the awe she once had. Now, the stars were just distant reminders of how small their rebellion was in the grand scheme of things. The Empire's forces stretched across the galaxy, and the resistance was a mere speck in the middle of it all. "Isla," John's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his face hard, his expression unreadable. "I can't sleep," she admitted quietly. "Too much on my mind." John nodded, stepping into the room. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there beside her, his gaze also directed at the stars. They didn't need words. Both of them understood the gravity of what was at stake. The rebellion wasn't just a fight for freedom anymore. It was a fight for survival. "Tomorrow," Isla said after a long silence, "we're either going to make history or disappear without a trace." John's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent promise of solidarity. "We'll make history," he said confidently, "together." But little did they know that togetherness would soon be tested in ways they couldn't have imagined. The next day, everything went wrong. The plan was supposed to unfold seamlessly. The team would infiltrate the Empire's central command station, plant explosives in critical locations, and take out the high-ranking officials in charge of the Empire's military strategy. Simple, effective, and swift. But as they advanced toward their target, Isla began to feel an unsettling change in the air. Something was off. As they neared the heart of the station, the first sign of trouble came. The doors that should have been locked, allowing only authorized personnel to enter, were wide open. Isla's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't part of the plan. The resistance had worked tirelessly to ensure that their target was protected, that their movements were unknown. But someone had gotten to them first. John looked at Isla, his face hardening as he felt the same tension. "Trap," he muttered under his breath. They moved swiftly, but the security was already tightening. It wasn't long before blaster fire rang out, echoing through the corridors. The station was alive with the sound of chaos, and the soldiers of the resistance were caught in the middle of it. "Fall back," Isla yelled, trying to maintain control of the situation. But as they turned to retreat, a shocking sight greeted them. One of their own, A trusted lieutenant who had been with the Resistance for years stood at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 Empire soldiers. He was holding a blaster aimed squarely at John. "Betrayal," John whispered, his voice barely audible. The lieutenant's face was cold, his eyes empty of the loyalty Isla had once thought he had. "I never believed in this rebellion," the lieutenant said, his voice flat. "You were all just pawns in a game. The Empire offered me more. Power, control. I took it." Isla felt her heart sink. She couldn't believe it. The lieutenant had been with them since the beginning. He had fought beside them, shared in their victories, and helped strategize their attacks. She had trusted him. And now, he had turned on them. You sold us out," Isla demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. The lieutenant didn't flinch. "It's just business," he said with a shrug. "You never stood a chance." John stepped forward, his gaze locked on the traitor. "You'll regret this," he growled, his voice low and filled with rage. "The Resistance won't stop. We'll take you down." But the lieutenant wasn't fazed. He motioned to the 2 soldiers flanking him, and they opened fire. John dove to the side, pulling Isla with him. The sound of blaster shots echoed in the narrow hallway, and the chaos around them intensified. The walls shook with the force of explosions, and Isla could feel her heart racing. "Go," John shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her forward. They couldn't afford to waste time. The betrayal had already set their plans back, but they couldn't let it stop them. They fought their way through the station, but the traitor's betrayal had caused a domino effect. More soldiers poured in from all directions, blocking every escape route. Isla could see the end of their mission slipping away with each passing second. "Keep moving," John urged. They reached a nearby maintenance tunnel, the only way out. But just as they were about to enter, another figure appeared, General Corin, the leader of the Resistance. He was standing in front of them, his face grim. "We've been compromised," Corin said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "The lieutenant was just the beginning. There are more traitors among us." Isla's heart dropped. Betrayal had poisoned their ranks, and now they were fighting not just the Empire, but the very people they had trusted. "We need to leave now," Corin said, turning toward the tunnel. "The Empire knows we're here." But as they ran, Isla couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The rebellion had been dealt a blow, but it wasn't finished. Not yet. They had to keep fighting, even if it meant facing betrayal from the very people they had called allies. The final battle had been fierce. The Resistance had been on the brink of collapse after the betrayal that tore their ranks apart. With each passing minute, the odds seemed stacked higher against them. The Empire, aware of their every move, had pushed back harder than ever before. But through it all, Isla and John refused to surrender. They couldn't. They wouldn't. The day had started in chaos. The last remaining members of the Resistance, including Isla and John, had fought tooth and nail through the narrow streets of the occupied city. Blaster fire, explosions, and the sound of battle echoed through the air. It was as if the entire galaxy was watching, waiting to see if humanity would rise or fall. But despite the chaos, there was a spark of hope. Every time they thought they were cornered, they fought their way out. Every time the Empire thought they had them, the Resistance found a way to survive. The human spirit, no matter how bruised or broken, was relentless. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about showing the Empire that no matter how advanced their technology or how much control they had over the galaxy, the human will to fight could never be crushed. Isla and John knew this, and with every blast that rocked the streets, they felt their hope grow stronger. The final push came at dawn. The Empire's forces had retreated for the moment, but they weren't done. They were regrouping, preparing for one last counterattack. The Resistance had their own plan, a risky one. They were going to strike at the heart of the Empire's military command center, a place that had been heavily guarded and nearly impossible to infiltrate. But the rebellion had one advantage. The Empire had underestimated the power of a united people, and now they were about to learn the truth. As the first light of day crept over the horizon, Isla and John led the final assault. The streets, once filled with blaster fire and chaos, had fallen eerily quiet. The silence was almost too heavy to bear, like the calm before a storm. Isla's heart raced as she watched John give the signal to advance. "Are you ready for this?" John asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Isla nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "We have no choice. This is our only shot." With that, they moved forward. The plan was simple but daring. They had to breach the heavily fortified gates of the command center, disable the Empire's security systems, and plant explosives in key areas. But as they neared the command center's entrance, something unexpected happened. A small group of soldiers, once thought to be allies, stepped forward, blocking their path. At first, Isla's heart sank. She knew these men. They had been with the Resistance for years. They had fought beside her and John. But now, they were standing in front of them, weapons drawn. "You can't win this," one of the soldiers said, his voice laced with fear. "The Empire is too powerful. You're fighting the losing battle." Isla's pulse quickened. "You're wrong," she replied, her voice firm. "We're fighting for more than just victory. We're fighting for freedom." The soldier didn't move, his weapon aimed directly at them. The air was thick with tension, but Isla refused to back down. They had come too far to turn back now. She stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We don't want to fight you," she said, her voice steady. "But if you stand in our way, we will." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons. Isla could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. The Empire's grip had been too tight for too long, and many had started to question their loyalty. This was their moment, the moment they could choose something better. The soldiers stepped aside, and Isla's heart swelled with hope. This was more than just a victory over the Empire. It was a victory over the fear that had held so many people in its grasp for so long. They stormed the command center, blasting through the gates and cutting down the guards with precision. The soldiers inside were taken by surprise, their defenses shattered in an instant. But there was no time to waste. Isla and John made their way to the heart of the station, where the Empire's leaders were waiting. The final confrontation was intense. The Empire's commanders, once thought to be untouchable, were now cowering before the Resistance. John and Isla fought their way through the corridors, finally reaching the control room. The leader of the Empire's military forces stood there, his face grim as he watched them approach. "You think you can defeat the Empire?" he sneered. "You're just a handful of rebels. Do you really believe you can change the galaxy?" Isla's eyes burned with determination. "We already have," she said, her voice steady. "The Empire is done." With one swift motion, she activated the explosives. The control room erupted in flames as the Empire's stronghold crumbled around them. The walls shook with the force of the explosion, and the once unshakable Empire was no more. Outside, the Resistance's victory was met with cheers. The people who had once been oppressed, who had lived in fear of the Empire's rule, were now free. The sky above was no longer filled with the ominous hum of the Empire's ships. It was filled with the light of a new day. John and Isla stood amidst the ruins of the command center, their faces grim but filled with relief. The fight had been long, and many lives had been lost. But in the end, they had triumphed. "This isn't the end," Isla said, looking up at the stars. "It's just the beginning." John nodded. "The galaxy is ours to rebuild, together." And with that, the Resistance's victory sparked a new hope. A hope that had been long buried under the weight of oppression. A hope that now burned brighter than ever before.